Eric, we have never done this before, but I think it's important. We're gonna have a trigger warning before this episode begins.
Yes. So for those who are invested in the canon narratives, I would even call them side stories because they feature so prominently at the beginning of every episode. But things like the deals we've made with Paimon, uh, and also Dave Draper. Things like our fight against not only countries that have appropriated the use of pyramid-like structures, but also the intergalactic threat that we've had to face. Of course, the legal intergalactic threat to be sure.
A Delaware
If
team against.
absolutely with our Delaware legal team, really the Aaron Brockovich story of an anonymous legal team in Delaware. Um, so if you're invested in those canon stories, this episode is going to be potentially triggering in that the topic is specifically, and okay, you've had the trigger warning, so I'm allowed to say it. I think that's the way it works. About things we've changed our mind on and times we reflect on when we were wrong previously. So obviously that does conflict with the canon iron culture, understanding that everything we say, as soon as it leaves our mouth, is fact and is unimpeachable. And if you remember something different, it is actually on you. So we are going to step outside of canon. We're going to break the third wall, fourth wall. What is? I don't know.
Fourth
We're going to
wall.
break some walls.
The
Fourth wall.
proverbial, not fourth wall, proverbial fourth wall. Eric, I will
You're
say
really
something,
getting into it. You're like pronouncing things wrong and everything. We're going right into flaws here.
bro.
Ooh.
This espresso.
I don't know which wall to break. You can't speak English. We're hurting people.
Eric, I'm Wreck-It Ralph today. It's this espresso. Gave me a stroke. I'm too caffeinated and hyped because I'm amped. I should say to break not only the fourth wall, but the fifth wall. Okay, we live in a just picture a structure, non-Euclidean geometry, and we can move forward. And that is
Or just the Pentagon.
what's that?
5 walls. Or just the Pentagon.
Yeah. Or
Five
this is the
walls.
Pentagon. We're breaking
Yep.
it down because Eric, here's the truth. So yeah, that's what we say. But to those listening, they're like, that's absurd. They can never be wrong. We were told by our producers, who, once again, because the sole function of any individual in a capitalist society is to maximize personal wealth, we decided we need maximum exposure here. And we had the analyst, right, take a look at our episodes. And you know what they said? They said, Eric, we weren't relatable enough. And I believe the phrase that they repeatedly said to us was that we're too hunky. And so when you're basically at that point where the hunkiness is too extreme, you're no longer relatable. Once again, we know this in classic films. Like, why do you think, as an example, Ringo Starr was chosen, this is a true story, as the fourth Beatle, right? Because they're like, oh gosh, if we choose someone that's hunky like us, then he's going to get 1/4 of like the fame, the wealth, the women, all that stuff. So they chose someone more homely, made it more relatable. And in the same way, much like big summer blockbusters, where they don't want someone that's just, man, can you imagine if we were in the Avengers? No one could focus on the plot. Thanos, I don't know what's going on. Some crystal, some cube, who gives a fuck? Okay, those two guys right there are shirtless, oiled up on top of the mountain, looking great. So you can't have that, right? Because it's distracting, it's blinding in its beauty. So this is the episode where we come down one level. So we're at the top of the pyramid, which to be honest is quite uncomfortable because if you know anything about pyramids, just look at the top. But we're going one level below to be a little bit more relatable, to talk about things apparently we said that we've changed our mind on, or maybe things that need just a little bit of reflection on.
I love it. You're doing a great job, Omar, of kind of like you broke the fourth wall,
Yeah.
but now like you're kind of halfway through it, like you're peeking your head through, because half of you is still staying canon, which I love.
Yeah.
And when we commit to a bit, the bit don't quit. And let me just say, it's a tough thing being hunky. You aren't relatable. You often feel isolated being so ridiculously good looking. So it is nice to be able to be understood by bringing this to a more humanizing level for us, because previously we were seen as basically Greek gods. So no, I think this is not only a favor to our audience, so they can learn how to revise opinions. It's also a favor to ourselves, because hashtag self-care. We need to feel like we're not, separate from society, because we're just that hunky. So I think, so thank you. We have 2 teams in Delaware. There's the legal team. There's also the analytical team.
Sure.
We appreciate that feedback. You need people to keep you grounded. That's all it is.
We want to thank, Jan and Bob out of Delaware,
Mm-hmm.
our astute analytical team. Best of the best. Best money can buy when you have a budget. Now, before we go on, because there are a lot of things to cover, because, man, when you've been in the public space for us collectively almost 2 decades, right? You say some shit. And maybe you want to go
Yes.
back and reflect on it. Before we do that, though, we mentioned this before. I do want to start, Eric, reading reviews because they leave them. After we had a Norwegian review, someone else from Norway left the review. When we said that, this is effed up, Eric is basically, he's a Kiwi as far as I'm concerned. And we have no reviews there. Someone left the review. You understand what I'm saying? So this is like the self-fulfilling prophecy where we're throwing it out there into the universe. And just like that great book that's totally true, The Secret, it's coming right back to us. So
Just call and response.
yeah, it's a little sing-song. It's a sing-along. This is a 5-star. Weirdly enough, they're basically all 5 stars. But the guy said culture changer, and that intro was for you because the individual said the podcast has literally created a Three Amigos vibe in the office I work in between me and 2 other guys, 2 other hunks. I think he thought to say, but he wanted to be once again more relatable. We have gained a joint identity as the Backwall Boys. Phrases like yakety yacked and getting yucky are widely accepted by the 3 of us, and I roll that by the other 8 coworkers. So he's putting out a vibe, Eric, in his office, blasting this shit, okay, on a boombox. They don't want to listen to it. He's making them listen to it. And he said, our bond rivals, even potentially Eric and Omar. Okay, definitely not, because that's a bold claim. But we're getting there. The info here is super practical, and though applied research is always a huge focal point, I love that there's enough experience and anecdotal experience to actually help things come into play. He goes on. It's honestly a pretty long review. It's very nice to say, like, keep it up, boys, and all that stuff. So we are the Backwall Boys.
I love it. And the fact that they reference Three Amigos means that's going to be one of my favorite reviews right there. So shout out Steve Martin, Martin Short, and Chevy Chase.
Yep.
If that movie isn't the best movie of all time in all genres, then I don't know what is.
Yeah, once again, accepted canon, so we can state these things. And you might hear in the future, once again, one of the 2 of us venture the opinion that another movie is the best. But again, check your ears. It's your understanding or misunderstanding of things. Eric, just before we begin, because I know we want to reflect on things we've changed or not mistakes we've made, but once again, reflections. Is there anything you want to talk about the fire post you made recently about the evidence-based community and one's relationship with evidence-based community? Or do you want to just go right on to the research, my friend? Because I want to give you a compliment. If you're not following Helms3DMJ on Instagram, you should, okay? You think it's just going to be hunky photos. That's what I thought, okay? That's why I started following him. And he's like, oh, let me hit you with my thoughts. I'm like, okay, bro, you want to play hard to get. But you made a recent post that I thought was fantastic. Do you just want to overview that for a second? Because we are speaking to the audience now, in all seriousness, about how they digest, consume, the function of it, and then the overall purpose. So we're talking about the relationship between the consumer and those creating the content. And I think us having the conversation about reflecting on the content we produce is very heavy, and it is perfectly suited to kind of what you wrote in that post.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, I've been really trying to level up my Instagram game lately, and I would say big shout out to my colleague in First Name, Dr. Eric Trexler, who, he's had a very unique strategy on Instagram of not doing a whole lot except reposting other things.
Yep.
And I've taken a slightly different approach to where I leverage the power of the platform by reposting podcasts I've done to say, hey, you need to leave the platform, which, as we know, is heavily rewarded by all platforms when you ask them to leave it.
Right.
And then also posting unedited videos of me training on my stories. So leave the platform and look at me lift mediocre weights has been my strategy to kind of, to grow that foundation. But also on top of that, cherry on the already perfect pie is that once every 3 months,
Yes.
I actually post something of substance where you don't have to leave the platform. And that happened, folks, I guess by the time this episode comes out, a week or a week and a half ago. I was. It was interesting. It was a kind of an old man reflection because we had an awesome guest article by Amanda Rizzo, our mental health specialist. She's been on the podcast. Fantastic, excellent episode back in the day with Corey Probst, where they talked about mental health and psychology of bodybuilding. But anyway, licensed clinical counselor. She's got her master's degrees. She's out there helping people mentally, and we greatly benefit from her insight. She wrote a fantastic blog article about perfectionism, and in the comments there was a really good discussion that got generated by someone who posted and said, "Hey, this is why I stopped following some of the science-based content." And my response to it was, "Well, that's really interesting. I'm surprised because for me, I was super neurotic and perfectionist, and it wasn't until I got exposed to evidence-based content and the science where I was able to narrow all the things I was trying to do." Because, and again, this is a different era. In 2005, I was separating carbs and fat. I was eating every 2 hours. I was eating a very high protein diet. I was wasting money on supplements that didn't do anything. I was limiting the food options I consumed. And I was just very overwhelmed by all of the things that I had to apparently, supposedly, kind of tick those boxes on around nutrient timing and meal sources and all the stuff, kind of the now probably pretty well myth-busted tropes. So it was very interesting to me now that the issue was there's too much of a stream of content from the evidence-based community that I feel like I often always have to change something and optimize it. So I spent the last couple of days reflecting on that, and I mentioned how, hey, so if we can distill this down, I have some advice for both content producers and consumers, which I can briefly state here. So now I'm summarizing an Instagram post just to really show you what has happened to the internet.
I'm summarizing a TikTok.
Exactly. So let me tell you about the dance. I danced. But all seriousness, I basically had advice for content consumers. So if you are following evidence-based content, I think it's really important to assess your motivation for doing so. And science is about curiosity. It should be motivated by wanting to learn more about something and should have an excitement behind it. And I think what a lot of people are talking about in that conversation was this like kind of fear of missing out, this FOMO, this idea that I need to stay up to date with the science-based content or I won't be making the gains I want. And maybe I'm missing out on things. And it's kind of this kind of neuroticism that can fuel it. And I think that's something you really do have to look internally on constantly to make sure that you're not feeding into that obsessive nature or that perfectionism that often goes hand in hand with bodybuilding, of course. So it's no surprise that I think that's a common experience. And then I thought, well, okay, I can't just put it all on the consumer. What can we do better? And I think it's less the content, because honestly, I only make content when I think it's something relevant. I don't really feel like I ever just put out material for material's sake. But I think that how we market it, and we've talked about this a lot on Iron Culture before, like that balance between needing to play the clickbait or the algorithm game to get eyeballs on content that will help people, versus not like having that title actually be detrimental or being something that doesn't deliver when you ultimately get to it. And one thing that I was thinking about is, what I'm not comfortable with is leveraging that neuroticism, that fear of missing out. Like, I don't want the title of something to make someone go then into the article or the podcast or the post or the product or whatever the hell it is with kind of that neuroticism or fear-based bias. So yeah, I think that was something. So I kind of spoke to both consumers and producers in there, and I was like, hey, just be aware, like, we probably shouldn't be leveraging fear. And for everyone out there, you probably want to be motivated by curiosity. And in general, science-based content should simplify your life. It should be a tool to use to make sense of all of the sea of information that is out there. That was kind of like the motivation behind me creating the pyramids, to give people priorities, an idea of what to focus on. So I think like hierarchies, understanding the hierarchies of evidence, and kind of helping people understand that should be really what the goal is. It's not to say that sometimes things do need to be slightly more complex, but that means you have to be starting from a place of A, oversimplifying things potentially, which does happen sometimes, and then B, also having pretty difficult or challenging goals. Obviously, if we're talking about like the 100-meter sprint, for example, where tenths of a second make multiple, placement differences at the highest level, or even qualifying, at the highest level, you do want to dot every I and cross every T. Ideally, you don't want to do it out of a place of fear again, but that excitement and motivation to perform and improve. But there are times and certain goals and extenuating situations where, yeah, it does need to get pretty complex, but that doesn't apply to everyone. So it's an interesting space I sit in as someone who directly provides support to like the bodybuilding, powerlifting community, which includes both recreational folks, but also competitors. And I think there does need to be a delineation between how that content is consumed, who it's directed at, and making sure you're clear on that as a producer. So it's just something I've been thinking about a lot lately.
Eric, you're underplaying it, and you underplayed it, by the way, as your Instagram-social media manager by just reposting the comment that spurred it. You should have had a hunky photo of yourself, then say swipe left to read it, because then the eyeballs will be on you, more engaged. But anyways, you do it your way, which is why you are who you are, and I love it. What I was going to say is excellent post, but I think even those people, because I think not that it's admitting defeat, it's not like, I just want to train, you know what I mean? Like, but why should I care about this? I think even if your function, it's a catharsis you get from lifting, you get a sense of fulfillment, and yeah, you don't want to be a world champion. We could talk about, once again, the hierarchy. So you're an Olympic level athlete. Yeah, you want to try and maximize everything. But regardless, I think, of who you are and where you fall on that spectrum, even if you just like to work out because you like to work out, we're all about self-betterment over time. It's a gradual process of self-improvement in some sort of way. That doesn't mean necessarily lifting more weight. It doesn't mean even getting more yakety yak. It could just be, hey, I'm getting more proficient with these lifts. I just want to become better. Anything that we dedicate a long period of our life towards, I think it's natural for humans to want to become better at it. That's just a function of being human. And I think being tethered to science, or being at least science adjacent, as we joke about, helps your subjective experience be tethered to some objective form of reality. It's like, okay, so I'm doing this, but wait a second here. Like, is what I'm doing, maybe can I do something a different way? Let me reflect on this. I want to get better. Okay, what can I do here? Rather than, I understand the idea that this is something that provides immense value for you, and something that, once again, might be far outside of merely like, oh, I want to lift more weight. But regardless of who you are, you probably want to get a little bit better. So I think being tethered to some sense of reality rather than that subjective experience. Like, I'm crushing it, bro. It's like, and then you take the photos, and then you send it to your coach because you haven't had a coach in years. Like, you look the exact same. So if you have no basis of comparison between your, once again, reality and actual reality, it could be tough. And I will say, Eric, just real quick, one of the things that I'm happy about, speaking of which, where you gave the consumers the options, like, oh, you feel like this is complicating your life, like someone, you're joking, I said that, like, I think, all the science of information is complicating my life, or like even this post, or like, should I even follow? It's like, unfollow it then. It's all good. Like, we're not. So I think driving people via fear is always a terrible tactic, a tactic that works. But also, that's why do you think you see the juicy headlines? So once again, the intrigue, like disaster, problems, negative, this, oh my God. It's just, it's marketing eclipses all too often human biology, where essentially it's gamifying the system. They know things that will get clicks. And one of the things that I'm super proud of, one in that post that is kind of our tonic, bro, and that is we're doing things our own damn way. And maybe that's egoed out, me complimenting ourselves once again, like we're doing it our way. But to your point, when we first started Iron Culture, this is a true story, we knew immediately episodes that would get a lot of views. We knew it, right? Verse titles. Yeah. And you said, when we're just, hey man, like, what do we want to do here? We said no. Like, it's like Eric Helms versus this would get probably 10 times 15. And these are easy tent poles to build something off of. I've done it before on YouTube, and it's weird. We've had this discussion before. The demon dragon that is the algorithm, that you see the rewards. Yeah. Like you're at the altar offering, right, to this god, and you're like, well, wait a second. Like I put this juicy headline and I got 5 times the amount of views. Well, wait a second. Well, why wouldn't I always have a juicy headline if I'm getting more financial incentives, more social media interaction, a more positive overall response? Because you're just the net you're casting is wider. And so one of the things I'm very proud of, both with that post kind of reiterating our tonic and this podcast, there's been no compromises, because guess what? We're not getting paid for this. We turned down that deal with, a podcast hosting service, let's just say, Eric. And if they were to play a song at our funeral, why, of course, it wouldn't be Frank Sinatra, Old Blue Eyes, I Did It My Way. It would be a punkier version, probably Sid Vicious singing, I Did It My Way. So I was super proud just when you said that about to the consumer, and then also just like a guiding light, like, yeah, this is what we're about here. This. You want to know what we're about? Here you go.
And I think another key element of it, just to take a less self-congratulatory note as we're still hanging out on the other side of this fourth wall, is I don't always get it right. And that's something that I was reflecting on for the last couple of days as well. I was trying to think about, am I adding to the sea of information? Am I just something that gets scrolled past and make someone feel like there is just more to focus on. And I mean, I can think of times where I would like to do it better, and I can't think of a few titles where I'm like, I wouldn't use that title again. But I think it just speaks to the fact that it is a challenging space to operate in. It is a difficult line to walk, and it's also very difficult to see, oh wow, that is a very successful message that has gone viral. It's terrible. However, those tactics may be able to be used for quote unquote good, and that is a difficult game to play. And I think a lot of the reason why there has been an explosion of accessibility of science-based information is essentially science-based communicators and evidence-based content producers are leveling up their marketing game.
Yeah.
But that's not going to be a perfectly, asymmetrical, positive wins-only outcome. I think that's just not realistic. And like anything, there should be a constant recalibration. So some of that post was me being surprised by someone who chimed in, which is I always appreciate when comments do that. And the easier path, which I think is a nice segue to our conversation that's about to come, is to just be like, nah, that's just a troll. I do it right. I'm infallible. I am the guiding light who keeps people who simplified, while everyone else around me are the ones who complicate it. So I think, yeah, that if you boastfully think that you've never gotten anything wrong, that ain't good. And if you can't change over time, then you probably should just be quiet and not make content at all, because you're definitely doing a lot wrong. You're not even aware of it.
Well, Eric, to your point, man, it's shocking. I could think of one very prominent YouTube channel that's still popular that, let's say, keeping up with maybe the literature, because when they graduated, I don't know, I'm guessing, from physiotherapy, maybe in like 2008, probably was current, for that time. So the information being provided was right there where everyone else was. So he was at the correct level in the market. But then as the body of evidence grows, as new things come to light, as there's reflections and all those other aspects, hopefully there is a change, potentially, if one needs to make a change in some of the opinions and some of the ways you view things. Like we talk about this all too often, but there hasn't been. And so you become a victim of not only of your own hype, but of your own kingdom, where you feel the need to defend it constantly because you've established an empire. So this is what you're known for. So I'm making this up, but if you're known as, hey, this is what I became famous for, it's like, but wait a second, maybe this isn't the best approach for things. It's like, am I going to change it? And I think one, it's ego driven. We've spoken about this before, but also it's one of those things that to admit it. I think in our society, it's almost a sign of weakness to admit that you're wrong. You know what I mean? Like it's one of those things that if you just double down on, if you just double down on it, Eric, it sounds better. Where it's like, well, wait a second. Oh, you thought I was wrong? No, I'm 100% right, and it's on you. And so I think the ability to reflect and the ability to take critiques, Eric, is the hallmark of any content creator that actually, I think, cares about the consumer, and maybe, to a lesser extent, so they check their ego. They're like, well, wait a second, what would be best for the consumer? And that's ultimately what's important. And I'll just say this, because there's a YouTube update that makes me sad boy mode. But I never try to pretend that I was even close to being right all the time, or to be honest, most of the time. Especially that's why I kept the early YouTube videos up. And so what I did on YouTube, speaking about things that I got wrong, all my videos are unlisted. Like if you know what? Wait, what did I say about mealtime? I said like meal. Oh, hey man, you need that peri-workout nutrition like circa 2009. It's unlisted because I want there to be the availability. You could, when you search it or whatnot, it'll still pop up. That if you want to see where I was in 2009, you can. If you want to see all the things I was incorrect on, you can. I don't want that floating around on YouTube, where if that's someone's first experience, then they watch that and then they're just down a bad rabbit hole. But I want that availability to be like, here are all here's everything I was incorrect about. And now YouTube, because I think it's maybe just a hosting thing, Eric, or maybe too much space. I don't know what's going on. Okay, I don't know what is happening with old Google and YouTube, but they're changing all unlisted videos to private videos in July. And so that's a weird conundrum where they can't. So people will no longer be able to see them. I think maybe they're just taking up too much space in the YouTube stores. I'm going to take a look at that, but that's some sad boy news.
So does that mean we won't be able to make videos unlisted and moving forward?
That's a good, bro. You're asking a question. I was just thinking about. I'm like, but these are all the like these are all my old friends for sale. Like this is. I don't know. I think maybe temporary. There'll probably be a window. You know what I mean? Like it could be unlisted.
Right.
Well, that's a good question too, because before, just real quick, not to go off topic here, but if you had, let's say you had a website and you uploaded on YouTube and it was unlisted, you could upload it and then people could view it. But if it's private, then they wouldn't be able to view it. That's an interesting question. Yeah. Anyways, sorry.
Yeah. It's interesting because like I don't have a ton of clients anymore. I only have like 5 at any given time. But the way I record like videos for them, video responses to their check-ins, is I just do an unlisted YouTube video on a account that has no public videos that I have, and I just send them the link to it because it's easier than other hosting platforms. So times are changing.
Sorry, not to derail it, but now we're gonna start. So, we led up to it. We went on the journey. We admitted that maybe sometimes we get it wrong. We spoke about the function of some of this information, or maybe how to utilize it, or reflections that you can have with yourself in your relationship with said information. We did the terrible thing where I shouted out Eric's social media, 3DMJ, Helms 3DMJ, which once again, any social media platform just absolutely loves when you tell them to get off their platform. They look at the algorithm, they're like, oh, wait a second, everyone dropped off at minute 24. Yep, let's definitely share this one. To check out that Instagram post, and now I said the same idea that on YouTube the mistakes are up there. Let's talk about some of these things then, Eric. And I think you have a few very potent ones to kick things off.
Absolutely. So yeah, instead of using satire to point out the issue with it never admitting you're wrong like we normally do, we've broken the fourth wall, and we're going to directly address the things that we've changed our mind on, rather than making ourselves into caricatures of people who never admit their flaws. So again, you've had the trigger warning. I don't need to keep stating it. But I think the first one that comes to mind for me is actually my thoughts around quote unquote metabolic adaptation. So if we go back to like circa 2009 into 2011, 2012, 2013, I think it was partially that we didn't have. Don't get me wrong, there's a ton of data on adaptive thermogenesis, metabolic adaptation, all that stuff going back to the 90s, which is essentially the energy expenditure you would predict someone having for their body weight post weight loss being less once they actually lose weight. The causes for that have been up for much debate, though. And I think back in the day, I definitely thought, like, if you do things like, quote unquote, building your metabolism by walking your carbs up slowly, or if you had things like refeeds and diet breaks, that those were very clearly kind of building one's metabolism. And I had like manipulation protocols around that. And this is one of those things where I wouldn't have been in trouble if I just simply hadn't tried to explain it as the mechanism, and if I instead just gone with my observations. Because I would say now in 2021, I think a lot of what we're seeing are changes in NEAT and are sometimes shifts in water balance. So rather than necessarily the physiological side of it, which is what I explained of it, not that it's not physiological, but that it's not like the RMR or BMR component. But absolutely, it is TDE changes. There is small changes in RMR and BMR, don't get me wrong, and there's a lot of individual variation. But I think a lot of those changes are not in the compartment of TDE that I previously thought. As we've learned now, although BMR and RMR is the largest component of your total daily energy expenditure, probably the most adaptive component of it is actually your non-exercise activity, which I think is kind of cool. It doesn't really change the reality of best practice necessarily, but as we learn more about it, it does clarify essentially the way that our body operates and how we observe things like the constrained model of energy expenditure and stuff like that.
Eric, we have an episode. I will shout it out. Our nemesis, friend. I forget what position we currently hold.
I think we're allies currently.
We've always been allies with Eurasia. Correct. I would say Derek Drexler. I don't know if he's related.
No.
Sorry. What?
Omar, we talked about this. Now that he's our ally, we call him Dr. Eric Drexler.
Yes. Dr. Eric Drexler. We have a fantastic episode on metabolic adaptation, going over the literature, talking about some of these things. Is there anything you want to add just real quick? Because I do think that's we have an entire episode on. I'm like, God damn.
Yeah, no, I think it leads nicely into, which is something we also have an episode on, the concept of reverse dieting versus recovery dieting. So I think, and this isn't evidence-based at all. In fact, this has always been counter to the evidence, but it became something that was a normal practice. Like the idea of, quote unquote, building your metabolism is slowly adding food. And I still think that's a good idea, like in the off season, Like when you're just trying to, basically you want to eat as much as you can while gaining at a good rate. And again, when I say off season, I do mean for competitors, right? This isn't something that you necessarily would need to do outside of those competitive contexts. So that you go into a contest prep with TDE being as high as it can, you're eating as much as you can, and you're not too high in body fat, and you're in a great position to start contest prep. I don't think you're truly like quote unquote building your metabolism. You are having a positive impact on TDEE. I just don't really like that terminology because I think it can lead someone to a narrative that's inaccurate. But where I don't think it's evidence-based, and really never has been, is that that's how you also rebuild your metabolism after a diet is over. When in reality, what we've seen is that you're going to have a reduced energy expenditure while you are weight reduced until you are not, especially if you're in a very low position of body fat and you've been dieting very hard and you're experiencing the symptoms of REDS because of low energy availability chronically, like you've gotten stage ready. So that's why I have pretty much always been against the more hardcore reverse dieting. That's not true. Actually, that's not true. In the last 8 years, I've been pretty fervently against the hardcore reverse dieting, but there was a period where I was focused on the downsides of rapidly accumulating body fat, or the perceived downsides and fears around it, and hopefully kind of wishing on a star that, oh, if we just slowly add food, then maybe you can, reset your set point, have a high metabolism, eat a lot of food. And in reality, what it did is just kind of sustain some of those negative effects, delay the time point before your off season was effective and you could actually build muscle, keep you in this low, poor hormonal state, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, ultimately the answer became, once I saw the negative effects of that anecdotally and I became more aware of the evidence, was, okay, look, we need to gain some body weight and body fat back. Probably shouldn't be, rapid binge eating and massive accumulation of fat to the point of overshooting, but we should not be cautious necessarily in our return to a reasonable kind of semi-lean off-season position, and then we can slow it down, which is essentially the recovery diet. So emphasizing recovery rather than trying to re-engineer your metabolic rate slowly back to something without gaining any body fat, which is pretty much a pipe dream and likely just further your disordered eating patterns, to be honest. So yeah, I think that's one I've also changed my mind on, which is tangential to metabolic adaptation, that we did a deep dive on not too long ago, actually, like what to do after the diet is over. So that's a great episode if you want to know more of what I'm talking about. But essentially, say 2012, 2013, we were trying out the reverse diet, and it just failed miserably with our clients, to be perfectly honest. And then as the more I dug into the data, I was like, this doesn't even make sense physiologically.
Eric, you gave two powerful ones. And what I like, actually, since we started once again Iron Culture, is there's no real need. When I say for revisions, it's like you, as someone that's produced YouTube content for a decade, you're like, oh man, like just the way that I shot that, the way the information was delivered, I could do that again. I'm like, no, we have the metabolic adaptation episode. Oh, you want to talk about refeeds, reverse dieting, of recovery diets, which we did probably within the last 15 episodes. You could go back, and I think that's one of the coolest aspects of this podcast. If you're a new listener, because we get new listeners all the time, you can work your way backwards, and there's a ton of information. So if we reference those things intra a podcast, that is why. One thing I want to say for myself, Eric, would be over prescribing things as it relates to clients, or being kind of the catch-all. And we spoke about this before, but the idea, it comes from the personal training background, where people come in hurt, either like physically or emotionally, where there's things that they want to fix that are outside of merely lifting. And let's say they have some ouchies, they have some pain. So either it could be some things that is best left to a physiotherapist, or also from a nutritional aspect where you overstate certain things or you overstep your boundaries. And that leads you into certain places then once you carry that attitude of like, oh, this person's clearly in a bad place, you want to help them, right? Because you see them like just there's a lot of things wrong. You can see that. I think a good personal trainer is someone who's empathetic. So if you see someone in pain, it doesn't matter which way. I'm not talking about like physical pain in the sense like their knee hurts or whatnot, but they're just in a bad spot. I think all too often when someone calls upon a personal trainer, they've reached a certain point in their life where they're looking to make a change. So there's been maybe a certain level of entropy that necessitated then that realization, like, what the hell is going on, right? Like all those emotional stories you hear that are very profound of people like, man, I'm just like, I had a personal training client say to me, like, I just want my wife to look at me the way like she looked at me 10 or 15 years ago. Like these are really deep seated things that I think if you just grew up, giving advice on social media, you didn't experience that. And you basically have to be a sociopath to like it not affect you. So you think like, yeah, man, like I got you. Let me look into this. Yeah, extra squat. We're gonna do some squats, balls, like nutrition. Oh, wait, your back's turning, foam rolling, right? So scope of practice becomes very important. But what happens after that when you take some of that attitude, well, like, yes, I want to help people, is that sometimes you enter some murky waters. And what I mean when I say that is that much like when we spoke, Eric, about gut health, I would say that for myself, talking about either mobility or talking about injuries, I had experts on or people that I thought were experts at the time. No disservice to anyone whatsoever, but because it's kind of a tenuous topic that is rapidly evolving and it's something that's undergoing revisions constantly, right? Some of that information then presented, or some of the people that then I brought on, if I had the knowledge now in 2021 that I did, I would not have chosen to give said platform or present that information. And it comes from that place once again, where again, you're seeing these people that are in the situation, or you're hearing these things like, oh man, like when I do this, this happens. And so I think moving away from an emphasis on some of the more structural issues, so or the causal link. Well, wait a second, like your shoulder hurts, it's definitely this. More towards that biopsychosocial model of pain, and also trying to enable, empower people through giving them access to the proper avenues. I do think one of the potential negatives on social media now is things enter different camps. And we had that episode, Eric, on pain that I think, once again, people can reference if they want a deeper dive on the topic. But things oscillate, you know what I mean? It goes towards like, I'm broken, I'm never going to be fixed. Like, holy shit, what's going on with me? Where they become enfeebled, right? To the point then where they hear a little bit like, oh, I'm completely fine, I don't need to get this checked out, or like, oh, I heard. So there's a fine line, the delineation between empowerment and then also just, the best practice for yourself. Like, hey, wait a second, do you have anyone in your area that's a qualified individual? So we had Nick Lacamelli on, right? A physiotherapist. Like, well, wait a second, I have this thing, it's not resolving itself. I have a positive relationship with myself where I'm not catastrophizing. I'm not thinking to myself, I'm never going to squat again. I really just want to squat again, and it's been 4 months. So there's a little bit of self-care that goes into that you need to tell the consumer, you need to tell the individual. But I was too much, the point is, with this error on my part, I was too much on the over-prescribing, or thinking like, oh, we have like the Rosetta Stone here. Here's what you can do definitively, because here's a problem, here's a solution, right? Here's the link right here. As opposed to, admitting the complexities of the issue and trying to delve a little bit deeper. And sometimes, once again, too, when you want to present a solution and you try and distill it down, then it loses some of the fidelity of the information. So I think circa 2015, from 2011 to 2015 or 16, I wish I did a better job on that then.
Actually, that's really good. There's two meta discussions there around this topic for both trainers and content producers that I think you brought up that are worth spending a little more time on. For trainers, I think there is a pressure because you form deep bonds with your clients, you have their trust. And while the trainer, even a really, really good trainer, can't be an expert on all the things that their client will bring to them. Like, even if you are the odd trainer that has like a master's degree in exercise and sport nutrition and is like a CSCS, and I know a number of them, even they can't have the ability to deal with exercise prescription for obscure diseases, or the skills that a doctor of physical therapy has, or the skills of a nurse practitioner, or the skills of a registered dietitian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Hopefully at that level, they have the knowledge to know that. But I think when you are a younger or earlier in your career personal trainer, you get the same things brought up to you. And even if you have like a good, rational thinking head and a good scope of practice, there is a certain pressure to have an answer all the time for your client. And you feel like you need to give them something. And not knowing what you don't know can get you into hot water sometimes, where you look back. And I can say this of myself. I look back 15 years ago at some of my personal training clients, and I'm like, God, I shouldn't have. It would have been better to be neutral, or to say I don't know, or just to give like a general recommendation of go see your doctor or something like that, because there would be a higher probability of not being wrong, right? Yeah. So I think yeah, the meta discussion there for trainers is, don't get too caught up in that pressure to have an answer. if something is not within your scope. Because like the textbook answer these days for the good personal trainer is, I don't know, but I can find that out for you and get back to you. That's not bad, but some things it's not even within your scope to try to research and to find out and get back to them. Like, hey, what do we need to modify for this injury I have? Or, hey, I currently have this illness, or, I have an eating disorder. The answer isn't, I don't know, but I'll get back to you. It's to say, I really am not the best person trained for that. I really appreciate you bringing it up to me. But can we find, or would you be comfortable with together us looking for a professional to bring into the team who you can also gain trust with and who can help me do a better job with you? Because I try to think, and I did this, back in 2005 and 6, me going home to research something with the level of knowledge I had at that point could very easily, like you were saying with your content production, lead me down the wrong rabbit hole. And I wouldn't know the difference. And I didn't know the difference back then, unfortunately. So that's the message for personal trainers. I think for content producers, it is be wary of what is hot and new, because I think we've talked about this before. Things that are on the bleeding edge of the scientific knowledge, things that we know about, are what invites kind of the charlatans. So, for example, and it's a challenging thing because the narrative, there's this, pendulum swings. Like, for example, gut health is a great example. There was a time point where in the evidence-based community, if you brought up the term gut health, you would immediately get labeled as pseudoscience. You need to stop, because so many people had abused the popularity of the concept and tried to sell you some snake oil. But there is like legitimate, interesting science going on in that space that's just happening, which means that it's not just pseudoscience. It's just that we don't have anything in the applied sector yet that a fitness influencer should be talking about. So I think even someone with good intentions, not someone who's trying to sell snake oil, and not someone who is, compensating and swinging the pendulum back and saying this is pseudoscience, who's saying, what I need to do? I need to get an expert on to talk about this. I think it's very easy, like you were talking about, as our narrative in the pain and injury space changes from being probably too dominant biomedically to now shifting more towards the biopsychosocial model. Like, of course, a 2015, Omar, or even myself, if we were to go out there and be like, oh, I need to get someone on to talk about this, there's a decent chance we might not get the most qualified person, So I think just be wary if you're a content producer. While those things that are on the bleeding edge and popular and making their rounds in the non-evidence-based community and probably would benefit from some clarity, we may not just be at that point where we can clarify it yet, because we just don't know. And you really do have to be someone who's kind of embedded in research that's at least adjacent to that research to know who to get on. It's a good thing I had met Gabriel Fondero, or I wouldn't have been capable of getting the right person or speaking on gut health back when we had that episode in 2019, for example.
Eric, that's one of the powerful aspects of this podcast. This is the episode where I just boost the podcast. But when we first joked about, this is like a reflection, also like origin story of Iron Culture, where you said, yeah, this is going to be the podcast where it's like your favorite expert's expert, where it's like, oh, like whatever, the science communicators, but where do they get their information from? Like, who's actually conducting the research? And so I think the curiosity, to your point of what the evidence-based community can provide, it's not about being right now. It's a gradual refinement in your thinking process. They'll lead you probably to better conclusions, but it's not like you're going for 100% accuracy rate, where you can reflect then and say, well, why did I think those things? And I think, interestingly enough, Eric, if I see, I'll state this. That's why I think understanding the critical processes and like being at least, a little bit on the path towards understanding some of the fundamentals can certainly help most people. That I see the platitudes that are espoused today by the average lifter are just almost, they accept them as self-evident truths. You know what I mean? Where there's something that someone else states, like, yeah, like count your macros or whatever, like calories and they're right. Like they are right. The fundamental assertions that they're making that they've heard that have been echoed now over the last like 5, 6, 7 years, they're right. But like the underlying mechanisms as to why are also not known. So I feel it's an interesting conversation to be had just very quickly, and that the platitudes in 2021 are far better than 2011, but they're still platitudes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Even when you're correct, you don't actually understand how it operates. Yeah, it's kind of the thing where like we accept that the plane we get on is going to work and fly, but I don't understand how a metal bird that doesn't flap its wings is getting from here across the world. I don't know how that works.
Yeah.
I don't understand how a combustion engine works. I know it does, though. I'm not wrong, So.
Yeah. And I do think to the point your post that you made that for most people like they just want to have a better practice. Like I want to achieve this. I want to lift a little bit more weight. I just want to know I'm on the right path, man. So I'm not saying like, hey, take a look on why you're on this path in the first place, but just have an openness, then a willingness to change your opinion. Understand that it is in fact it's not a truth, but an opinion that you hold, and as things shift, understand maybe where that might be coming from. And that brings me actually, Eric, just
actually really quick,
go.
To point something out of what you said. There's a huge difference between saying I am not about digging deeper, and saying anyone who digs deeper is an idiot for trying to overcomplicate this. And that is this huge like thing on YouTube right now, where it's this purposeful denigration of the idea of digging deeper and understanding the mechanisms of something and having that curiosity, and then blanket blaming it as that's just overcomplication. And like they're going out and trying to confuse you, when in reality it is kind of taking shots at a group of people who are just curious, which I think it's kind of scary anti-science book burny to me. That whole like I'm going to shut this down anytime you start to think about this on a deeper level, because it's just unnecessary and bad,
Eric, let me do my bullshit psychoanalysis of this. But the truth is, with those content creators that are decrying, let's say those that are more just on the evidence-based game, trying to do a deeper dive, trying to have some critical thinking, it's scary to them, right? Because it's maybe a personal affront to the empire that they've established. Because if you begin poking holes at the fundamental assumptions, is it just a house of cards, perhaps? So it's almost like a survival mechanism on their end, where it's like, I'm gonna throw the funk towards you and say you're the one that's making it wrong. Where they're raising. I think that is in an open society, having conversations are always necessary. And if you're just wondering why things are the way they are, that's a fundamental aspect of being human, right? And if you're not willing to have that discourse, then that becomes dangerous. And to your point, real quick, we were speaking about different things off camera, but Isaac Asimov has that quote about the dangers of anti-intellectualism. The idea that, well, this person had, you spent your 8, 10, 12 years in school, you got your PhD, you really thought about these things, okay? And you learned the process, the scientific method, all those things. And you've thought about it enough where you're able now to distill it towards the masses and have the considerations that what would be best on their end. And then you have a lobbyist. So we talk like climate change, it doesn't matter. Someone who is not educated on this topic, that is savvy with marketing, so they sound good. They have a silver tongue. And that's the part that probably gets me the most. To your point, I think one of the most truthful things you've said in this episode is that the evidence-based community has gotten better at marketing. So communicating to the general populace, right? Because the danger becomes if someone is a silver tongue and they're able to more effectively communicate to the masses a message that is inherently flawed, they're going to overpower it. And even if you look at social signals, so the body language of someone, they seem really confident. Oh my God, the social proof, this individual is jacked. It just completely circumvents anything. Well, this guy's actually this guy on the right, he's completely right. He's saying it in a way that is not easy to absorb. And he seems nerdy and he's not as jacked as that other guy. So clearly he's wrong. It becomes incredibly dangerous. And to your point, man, I completely agree that as soon as you basically start making fun out of individuals who are curious, curiosity is the worst thing in the world, and the inquisitiveness, that's the thing that's actually preventing them from making gains, man. That it does become super scary. It becomes Fahrenheit 451, bro.
That's what's up. Yep. I agree. So I don't have much more to say on that. I think you said it well. Other shit we were wrong about. Let's see. Protein intake. That's something that's kind of been this sliding scale downward for me since I was a bodybuilder who would I think honestly back in the day, we're talking 05, 06, 07, 08, I knew high protein intakes were better with quotations around new, and I was semi-dismissive of anything that was against it, and I would sometimes be a little anti-science because I think all these lab coats aren't measuring it the right way. Nitrogen balance is trash. They're thinking about what's the nutritional requirement, not what's optimal for gaining muscle or strength. And I would not look that deep into some of the data that did come out of the 80s and 90s that looked at bodybuilders, and sure, it was nitrogen balance, but they also did some measurements of the short term of strength and hypertrophy. And I think that slowly evolved until like I remember I did actually try a 2 gram per pound protein diet early on before I was, that's a lot of fucking protein.
Yeah.
Before I was like getting into research or anything. We're talking like 2006, just to be clear to the listener. And then it was around like 2009, 2010 that I was getting engaging with the research. And then in 2011 and then 12 is when I was like, I'm going to go out to New Zealand. I'm going to do this research and I'm actually interested in finding out the truth. And it was at that point where I was open to it, but I was now aware of my bias, right? And I thought, well, let me entertain my bias because it didn't come out of nothing. Like, why are all the anecdotes, like even in the I eat I'm a low protein guy in the bodybuilding community, was still considered a high protein intake in the scientific community. Like there was no bodybuilding voices that aligned with what was actually in the scientific research at that time. Like generally the highest protein intake you'd see recommended was like the 1.4 to 1.7 grams per kg. And that is like right now, an example would be like Menno, the iconoclast, who recommends like 0.83 grams per pound. That's 1.8, which was still at the time, we're talking like 2010 or 11, generally above the majority of recommendations. So there was no low protein voice. So anyway, so I think I look at what would I have recommended in 2011? Probably close to a gram and a half per pound, just to be quote unquote safe, and maybe high like that in a deficit, maybe slightly lower in a surplus. And these days, as more and more evidence is accumulated, I think the magnitude of effect is far smaller, just the impact that protein can have in the grand scheme of things. It is important, it does matter, and you should be eating a sufficient amount of protein, but an insufficient amount of protein will still get you like gains if you're lifting weights progressively, and just slower, which is interesting. So like it's slid down to now my recommendation that I use is based on a meta-analysis I was part of that was led by the folks in Stu Phillips' lab in the off season at least. It is like 0.7 to 1 gram per pound. And I acknowledge that, and that's the better safe than sorry upper end of that confidence interval range, you know? And then the idea of maybe you want to be slightly higher than that or at the top end of that range for dieting. So really there's like most of the time I'm never recommending more than like 2.5, 2.6 grams per kg or around 1.2 grams per pound, when I think my default setting was 1.5 back in the day. Which was really just based on, man, every bodybuilder thinks you should be eating high protein. How could all their anecdotes be that wrong? And yeah, and there's a number of reasons why I think that is. I think there's a more is better mentality. We don't really know the effects of anabolic steroids on what you can benefit from. And, you know, when you can do a crash diet and compensate with anabolics and really not be consuming much in the way of fat, like, you know, the calories got to go somewhere, right? You know, so I think there's a lot of things going on that can contribute to that. And, you know, you could argue there are some benefits that are non-related to strength gain or muscle retention as far as, you know, perceived effort and potentially satiety and some other things that might happen at the higher end of those protein recommendations I mentioned. But still, I just don't think it makes that much sense if you end up cutting back from carbohydrates and fat to go over like kind of that range in most cases.
Eric, I don't know if it's the espresso that's making me just, you know, flowery with some of the positive things I'll say. But here's the genuine question. When one has serious convictions, and so, you know, circa 2006, you're like, wait a second, like, how are they doing this research? Like, what's going on here? Sometimes in science, you have to examine if a thing's a thing. To your point, like, were there any bodybuilding voices in the space? And once you conduct then the research, you could say, okay. But my question then for you, because what I heard from that is, here's someone who's passionate about lifting that holds some of these things that you feel like anecdotally or you know, from your observations of the people that you interact with, and there is that separation because the research isn't quite there. I believe these convictions to be true. Not to say that you're entrenched that no matter what, in the face of overwhelming evidence, like, guess what, bro, I'm not going to change my opinion. But as the evidence grows, then there's a refinement. The question for you very quickly, when it comes to some of these more gray areas, what role does conviction play then? Because I think that leads you on, it led you on a journey, you know what I mean, Eric? It led you on a journey, on the discovery journey towards doing some of the research that then led to the gradual refinement. So you still had the openness, but you had a belief, an assertion that came from experience. And I think that in the grand scheme of things, that's incredibly valuable because it's something that I'm kind of envisioning when I spoke about those platitudes is that if someone, not that they're like a fair weather position holder on everything, they're just waiting, like, what's the latest meta analysis? I'm like, that's great just to hold like the temperature of the room. Like, you're basically just the temperature of the room. Like, what is the current? That is completely fine. And if you're not, once again, science literate, that's probably a safe position to have. But what would you say, is there utility in having convictions when it comes to these things that lead you on a journey?
Yeah, I think conviction is a motivating factor for humans, and there's no way around it. And I don't think the goal is to become dispassionate, which I think some people do confuse. Like rationalism, we need to divorce ourselves from emotion. There is no divorcing ourselves from emotion as humans. It is what is the underlying motivating factors. So I think ultimately it comes down to the worldview, and I. So what? I think so. For some people, conviction leads towards I have the truth and it doesn't need to be tested. I think for me, conviction led to a hypothesis, and my hypothesis was, and I'm pretty sure when I test this, higher proteins are going to win out. And they kind of like sort of did, but a little bit, but not really. Like, so I had to therefore go, oh, interesting. Like my convictions were not fully founded. Like, I wasn't totally wrong. I wasn't like the higher protein group got worse gains than the moderate protein group or the lower protein group. And overall, on balance, it helped me. The conviction motivated me to look into the data, and I did indeed have a bias going into it. Ultimately, that's what hypotheses are. There's no way around it. If you form a hypothesis, it's what you think is going to happen. So there is no such thing as eliminating bias, and there's nothing wrong with the bias that you come by honestly, and that you have a willingness to test. So I think it does come down to kind of divorcing the ego from it, but not the conviction, the passion. Like, yeah. I think if we have a society that doesn't reward doubling down, and if we have a society that doesn't tell you like you will be ostracized in some way for being wrong, but that's not the society we have. We love to see people with a lot of conviction fall from grace, Like, that's something we get off on, right? So I think some of the things that make it harder for scientists and communicators and content producers is the social rewards and punishments around being right and wrong. So I think that's something that is, if you really struggle with that, I don't want you to produce a lot of content, to be honest. So I do think you have to be able to distinguish between those. So for example, one of the interesting things when you look at the protein data overall, like I said, the effect sizes are small to moderate at best, even when you compare low to high protein intakes. However, I'm literally only aware of one study ever where a lower protein group had a significant better finding in terms of body composition compared to a higher protein group. And that is probably out of 4-digit number of studies. So ultimately that comes down to sampling variance. Like, it's got to. Like, when it all is neutral to positive, I think that tells you something. Now, the interesting thing, though, is something like 60 to 80% of the data is neutral. No significant difference. So this is the nature of having a small effect, because there's an intrinsic relationship between sample size and power. Yeah. So if protein has a consistent small effect and you do a whole bunch of small sample size studies, the vast majority of them should show no significant difference between groups. These guys ate 2 grams per kg. These guys ate 1 gram per kg. These gals ate 1.6. These gals ate 0.8. Most of the time there won't be a difference, but occasionally it should lean positive, and then every once in a blue moon it should lean negative, and that's exactly what we have. So I think that conviction led me towards dampening my the importance overall on protein anyway. And I think it's not that bodybuilders are wrong and strength athletes are wrong that high protein intakes are important. It's that they're wrong in how much of a difference they think it makes. And that is ultimately something that you see very, very consistent as an attitude in the bodybuilding and strength training community, is that they often do correctly identify things that have a positive effect via anecdote, but then they get a lot of hyperbole behind them because that more is better attitude. And because a lot of people share the anecdote. So it's kind of this like groupthink mentality, like everyone eats high protein. You're an idiot not to. It's like, well, yeah, like everyone does a lot of things that make a small difference. Like, we all notice it, but it doesn't mean it's super, super, super important, So yeah.
I'm still eating 400 grams of protein a day, whatever. I will say, Eric, that that conviction can lead then to the curiosity. And the curiosity isn't trying to find out if you're right, it's trying to find out the truth. So it's divorcing yourself then from the outcome and be more interested in the outcome itself. And I think that's probably one of the differences with yourself or those that actually conduct research. I was going to make the comparison. I was like, wow, I'm really going to do this, of Galileo and the idea of having convictions in the face of like, the established norms at the time to protein intake. But I was like, that might be a little bit, everyone's like, everyone just listens like, all right, calm down, guys. It's just protein intake for recreational lifters. I almost went there though, the power, like when conviction can be useful. But I will say, Eric, because you've covered so many, my graveyard's bigger than yours, bro. Like where do we want to start on things that, you know what I mean? But I will say one of the things that, we spoke about recently, and it is partially inspired, certainly by our conversations, would be a reevaluation of power building. Guess what? I'm publicly declaring this now. Mike O'Hearn, you could keep it, where he said,
I'm sharing this with you, buddy. You go ahead. I'm saying we both have this body in our graveyard. You go ahead.
We buried that body together, and that was one of our formative experiences. But so I'm saying I'm publicly declaring that Mike O'Hearn can be the progenitor of power building, because you can keep that shit. I'm divorcing myself from it. I was a popularizer. Okay, I was on like, hey, like, yeah, I think this is useful. Because like, here's the thing, as you said, Eric, I think being aware of some of the biases that we have, like bodybuilding, once again, like a more maybe being better. I like to lift heavy. I like to do these compound movements. I kind of want to do them more, right? Like if I'm to be in a gym, if I'm to be in a space, and you tell me, man, you could just squat and you're going to get the big legs. I like squatting, like me doing, the leg press, then you do the hack squat, and then wait a second, you're going to make sure you do the leg extension. You're going to hold it for a second. If you tell me that, it's like, Doc, Omar, you just squat. There's an elegance and beauty in the simplicity and the dose response relationship that you could sometimes fall victim of, where it's like, I want to get stronger. But if I want to get stronger, the question of specificity, well, yeah, I could do my accessory movements with the leg press, but wouldn't it certainly be more beneficial to do my 5x5 at 70% on the squat instead? And so it entered a rabbit hole for me of inevitably where I noticed I try to ignore some of those signs, like once again talking about the biopsychosocial model of pain, that there's a dose response relationship. There's a certain amount of volume maybe I need to do requisite volume for hypertrophy. And maybe that amount of volume is something that it turns out, if I do it with the current form I have and all the other variables, that my ability to recover consistently in a dependable fashion as it relates to strength isn't there. So it's not this best of all possible worlds where I'm just going to squat away all my problems. And that's kind of a hard pill to swallow. It's like you could think, I think there are certain levels, right? If you're a beginner, yeah, man, like you want to squat and like you have your quads are like this big, and gradually over time they will grow. If you just, you have a simplistic program, you have a barbell at home, you're lifting in a garage gym, it will serve you well as a beginner, as an intermediate. I think as you get more advanced on the journey, there needs to be that gradual refinement. And a place that I got stuck at basically, and me speaking about it, me talking about it, because a lot of the people, once again, you get that feedback. You have intermediate lifters, Eric. They're then following the program. Well, yeah, I did my 5x5, I did my top single, then I did my 5x5, and I did this. I follow your program, and I got a 30-pound increase. It's like, that's great. But it's like, where is the graveyard of people that were non-responders, right? Because they're not as vocal. Like normally on social media, things are amplified. I got amazing results, or like I didn't really get results. So you don't have an accurate reflection unless you do maybe an exit survey of people following your programs. Anyways, not to digress, but for me, myself, personally, because I care about these gains, bro, I was in that weird space while I was trying to do the same thing. I was trying to use the same movements for the same function, and I wasn't getting the desired result. And based upon some of our conversations, I mean, man, circa 2019, when you spoke about how you had the FAI surgery, and then how you found workarounds. So conclusively, you managed to make your quads bigger by not squatting. And so you were able to prove a thing. Like I could do movements outside of the holy grail that is a squat and actually grow my quads. And then to take that logic a little bit further, it's like, well, do I have to just squat if I want to get stronger? Like, what do I actually need to do to get, like, what is getting stronger then, right? And so anyways, it led me on a journey of a gradual reduction of how much volume one needs to do in order to get stronger, and strip just to the bare necessities. And that's why maybe I said at the start of the podcast, well, I've been dealing more in probabilities, where now I think every year I kind of want to accomplish the goals I have. I want to have the highest probability of succeeding with those goals. And I used to have this crazy, I think we spoke about this, where if I could handle the volume, let's say my upper body, and I could recover from it, I will get a high yield return on it. So like my bench press will increase, my overhead press. It wasn't the same with the squat, right? So it's like if I could go through the fire, basically, I'll be victorious. But it wasn't happening. So it's like, well, you only have like a 54% chance, Omar, of like walking through this shit on the other side. It's like, what if you did this other training style where you had a higher frequency, more specific, so more singles, but lower total volume, and then you oscillate, you work up the intensity, and then you lower back down, and you have like a 90% chance of getting a PR. Yeah, maybe the total yield, the total return, like your strength increase will be 2.3% versus like 3.4% if you did this like all this volume, but you're getting that 2.3%. So I went with the 2.3%. So that all that to say that the emphasis on power building that is doing both your volume and intensity work with the same movement is something I've removed myself with gradually over time. It certainly has its time and place, but as this catch-all, like, damn, bro, you want to get jacked? Well, just squat a lot and just do singles or deadlift or overhead press or bench press. It's something I've certainly stepped away with over time.
I would put forth that I was actually worse than you because I was a competitor in both and trying to post hoc justify my preferences. But I did rapidly get better. There's two things I want to say though. I think again, I keep doing these little meta commentaries on the things you say. One thing that I want to say is the value of anecdotes. I think sometimes the very, very strict experimentalist only evidence-based, and I put that in quotes, person basically looks at evidence-based practice and goes, you know what, I'm going to cut off two of the legs of that stool. I only care about science. Screw individual differences and preferences. Screw experience. And in the same vein, I know there's an evidence hierarchy and that, the bottom 20% of it is that space that says observations and anecdotes. I'm just going to cut that off too because that doesn't count. I think that is really problematic because it almost makes it sound like anecdotes don't exist. Like they are just as reliable as random, which can't be the case because the scientific process is the process of observing. And the only reason why science has evolved over time is we've developed technology and systems of observing more reliably and then how to improve the quality of our observations. But it's all fundamentally observations, which are what anecdotes are. Just filtered through the pure subjective experience of humans, but everything is. So we can't let go of anecdotes, but it is really important to discuss what the casual fitness anecdote can and can't tell you. And ultimately, what we know is if we see someone who did something that is counter to the anecdote, that the anecdote must be false, at least in some cases. So for example, going back to the protein anecdote that I was heavily relying on, where all bodybuilders are on high protein diets, that I cannot know from that anecdote that high protein diets are a requirement to be a bodybuilder. But I can know that high protein diets don't prevent people from being successful bodybuilders. And I think that's actually a really important distinction. It's kind of that nebulous, the difference between innocent and not guilty, but it's a really important distinction. So it's kind of that saying, success leaves clues. What clues does it leave? It tells you that what they're doing was sufficient for success, but not necessary for success. And I think that's a really important distinction. So that's the one meta comment that I want to make on what you said, which is really good. And then as far as my own journey with power building, for those who don't know, my first competition ever was an unsanctioned YMCA push-pull meet in 2006. Yeah. So the first thing I ever competed in was powerlifting. As much as we joke about bodybuilding being the supreme sport, that's tongue-in-cheek to some degree. I've always competed in strength sport and physique sport and love doing both. But I've also, as I've shared many times in this podcast, been very obsessive and perfectionist in nature when I first started. So I needed to rationalize how my decision to compete in both wasn't sacrificing either. So the relationship between hypertrophy and strength, exercise selection, and the superiority over free weight compound exercises, the importance of load. These are all things where I've had biases where I'm looking for the data, and not so much anymore, but I used to. I look for the data which supports higher load training for hypertrophy, not just strength. I look for the data which supports that compound movements are really the key drivers of hypertrophy, and that additional isolation movement is not necessary or not that beneficial. And this led me actually to a path of degrading my bodybuilding progress to where my training became more and more and more and more about just increasing my 1RM to the point where I was doing things that ultimately resulted in me losing some size. And I was essentially just running powerlifting programs in throwing in like lateral raises, calf raises, and leg curls, and a little bit of arm work. Like that was literally, and if you had talked to me in like 2010, I would have been like, training for strength and size are essentially identical. If you just want to get strong everywhere, you will get big everywhere. There's no way for you to keep, getting stronger without also getting bigger. And it's like a partial truth, because you will plateau in strength if you don't get bigger over time. However, you can see reasonably robust over midterm timeframes increases in strength that are due to you really optimizing all the other things related to strength while you don't get bigger. And that's basically what I saw, is my upper body was getting smaller while I was doing more and more heavy work on bench, but not sufficient volume, and doing things like chains and bands and a lot of variations of the main lift. And I remember I got to a point where my upper body was about the smallest it had been, but I was hanging around and basically stuck around like a 3-plate bench. And lo and behold, later down the track, how did I actually get my bench up from there? Was I'd started doing a crap ton of volume on bench and accessory work and a lot of pressing with a high frequency, which really was just a vehicle for volume. And that's when my bench finally moved again. And it was because I grew. So it's this funny thing where powerlifting requires hypertrophy. Hypertrophy will lead to strength, but that is not the same thing as saying that training for powerlifting and bodybuilding is identical. And I think a lot of people are in this graveyard with us, or that like version 1 of the DUP in 2013 bodied a lot of people who weren't built for daily squats type of deal. Yeah. So I'm right there with you, man. I have definitely revised my position to now. I think that if someone generally wants to get bigger and stronger, they should probably follow kind of a power building approach, but modified in the ways we've talked about many times on Iron Culture. And most people, I would say, who are not competitors do have concurrent strength and hypertrophy goals. They kind of go hand in hand. But I would say that for people who are competitors, you can sacrifice very little. You can be a good power lifter and a good bodybuilder, and there's many examples over time of people who have done that. But if your goal is to do everything perfect specifically for competitive bodybuilding, or everything perfect for competitive powerlifting or weightlifting, there must be some sacrifice, although it's far smaller than saying I want to be a competitive powerlifter and a marathon runner. So I think sometimes the pushback is also these platitudes like, there's no such thing as a good power building program. You're compromising. It's like, yeah, but the degree of compromising is actually quite small. Yeah. Especially for someone who, let's say, like has good levers for squat, bench, and deadlift. They give up very little. It is something though. And I think that needs to be acknowledged, which is what I didn't do previously.
Yeah, it's like trying to quantify what that amount is would be impossible, but just understanding that there are trade-offs with every potential solution. Yes. Where it's like, yeah, you want to compete in bodybuilding, but you also love powerlifting, you love the strength movements. This is not the number. It's like, yeah, it might be like a 5% trade-off. Like if you just focused on one or the other, because the nature of specificity is like you need to make certain choices, and with those choices are trade-offs. Well, wait a second. I'm spending like even all the mental energy. You think about that when you spoke about that the block you did where you're training like more for strength and like your bench press was like kind of going up, and the hypertrophy work was not there, so your chest was getting smaller. Think about all the hype ups. Like people, I think they undervalue that. Where you hear some of these statements, Eric, like, oh yeah, I'll throw in the accessories after. It's like, but think about the quality of the training. Where if you have to work up to the 1RM, so let's say we're doing typical shit like work up to something at an 8 or at a 9, then you do your back down sets. Man, to prepare for that, like you're going to war in your head, you got your headphones on. It's 30 minutes to warm up to the top single. Do you think the quality of, let's say it's time to do lateral raises, like the quality of those lateral raises, do you think it's going to be the same as if you just did like a 3x8 at 7? Right, for your hypertrophy work, so squats instead. Let's just say you're keeping with squats, and then you move on to the lateral raises. Do you think you still have the same capacity to really go there for the lateral raises, or do you think something's got to give, right? And so I think that trite idea that you could just fix it by throwing in the movements, and that's where people throw around that term junk volume. But I do think one of the things to emphasize, and maybe not when I say close it out, because we're talking for an hour and a half, but another body, I dug that shit and I'm burying it, Eric, and now I'm digging it back up, and guess what? It's moldy. Would be just excess volume. So for myself, I would say as someone like more Yngwie Malmsteen, it's like, how's less more? More is more, right? Where you're on this constant arms race with yourself, where whatever you did before, either volume or the weight that you lifted, it must increase over time. And it's like this perpetual arms race that you enter, that there's almost that FOMO, fear of missing out, but fear of missing out on gains, where you start throwing in volume and you don't, it's insidious how it works, where you don't notice the quality of your training go down. Because like, yeah, man, like whatever, I'm making up these numbers here. Let's say you're doing 18 sets per week for a particular muscle group, and then you gradually increase it like 20 or 22, 24, whatever. And you don't notice it though in that single session, but your focus, because I do think there's a finite amount of focus one can have, even if you're a super motivated individual. These are just these are one of the intangibles that people don't talk about. There's a certain amount of juice you can have per training session, and you need to allocate it effectively. And so what I was doing was spreading myself too thin, and that's recently when I went from training 6 times a week. That was more by necessity, right? Not having access, and me being also like, oh, I'm really going to travel during the pandemic all the way here to get my training. Let me just train 4 times a week. So like it was a choice of practicality that led to some reflections. And then the question was, well, how much volume do you really need? And like, what is this volume actually doing? And what are my goals, right? And is it actually helping me towards my goals? And when I noticed that my recoverability went up, my willingness to train, so session to session, where I was more excited, and it seemed like my session performance was improving, and then just my ability to focus on that session, all those qualitative assessments, self-assessments I made. I was like, wait a second, what's going on here? Because I'd fallen into that trap, Eric, where it's like, well, I started training 4 times a week when I first started training, then went to 5 times a week. And basically, it was like this over time, right? So it was like 4, 5, 6. I'm like, well, now I'm at 6. And then the question basically pre-pandemic to me would have been like, maybe it should be 7 times. Like, like what's the next, like what's really robbing me of my gains? But man, what a funny thing, because you could know something, you could know it to be true, but then to tell yourself and to coach yourself, that's something entirely different. Where like, if you were to look at your own program, if someone was to give you your own program, you're like, oh, like, what are you doing here? So some of the delusions that you can have. But yeah, high volume, I'd say an emphasis on the pure volume, irrespective then of quality, was a detriment to my own training.
I love it. So if you're gonna unearth your multi-body of volume, I'll unearth what I would say is like a still ripe, and maybe it wasn't even actually dead body of frequency.
Sure.
Because this is one where, like, if you look all the way back to when I recorded the muscle and strength training pyramid YouTube videos, like in 2013, I have always described frequency as a vehicle for volume.
Yep.
But so the funny thing is, like, we've kind of gotten back to where I started, but there was a period, I would say, from say 2016 to 2018, maybe even 2015 as well, where I'd say the data was overall leaning toward there's an independent but small positive effect from higher frequency, independent of volume. And I think now the data has actually gone the other way. So like, if you read the first edition of my muscle and strength pyramid books, I largely talk about, hey, you want to manipulate frequency as a way to accommodate volume increases, which might be required for you to keep making progress. And then in 2019, when I wrote the second edition, we were at a point where most of the meta-analyses were leaning towards higher frequency. There was one in 2016, which came out, I think Schoenfeld was either probably the lead author, or it might have been Gurgic. Actually, hold on, I got it pulled up. I don't have to miscite anybody. So yeah, in 2016, there was a meta-analysis led by, let's see, it was, too many windows, Omar.
Look, man, stays ready.
Schoenfeld, Ogborn, and Krieger, shout out. It was basically saying, hey, when we look at the overall volume equated basis, training muscle groups between 1 to 3 times per week on a volume equated basis, it says, hey, it's probably better to train more than once per week. And that was kind of where we're at. Okay, so for hypertrophy, once per week is probably not enough. And I basically had that in the pyramids. Like, look, once you get past kind of the bro split, you're good, but after that, it doesn't make a difference. In addition to that, there was a non-published couple of meta-analyses on strength and hypertrophy that Greg Nuckols did on Stronger by Science, where he found a small independent effect for like bench press and hypertrophy. It was a small effect, don't get me wrong, of higher frequency. And that's where we were at. But then in the last couple of years, that has really changed. So there was the most recent one, just came out in April, was by Cuthbert and colleagues. And shout out to Stronger by Science. They actually just recently covered this. So they're forcing us to toe the party line as allies now. We have to also come out it's discussing volume. It's just kind of the way it works, folks. But anyway, in all seriousness, April 2021, Cuthbert and colleagues, they ran a meta-analysis. There's more research now. There's been a lot done. And they concluded that over the 6 to 12 week period, there are no clear differences in maximal strength development between training frequencies and well-trained populations. However, there is a note in a number of these meta-analyses that come out recently that when we don't control for volume, higher frequencies do seem to beat out lower frequencies. So it's really a volume effect. And that was actually stated quite well in the Gurgic meta-analysis that came out in 2018, which also found gains in muscular strength were not benefited by higher frequencies. But they say the results of the present systematic review and meta-analyses suggest a significant effect of resistance training frequency as higher training frequencies are translated into greater muscular strength gains. However, these effects seem to be primarily driven by training volume because when the volume equated, there was no significant effect of resistance training frequency on muscular strength gains. So we've basically gotten back to the place where we started, where frequency is a vehicle for volume, but not necessarily in all cases a independent positive thing. But I think the last thing I want to say is that, and this has been found in other ones as well. There's like Ralston, and there's a recent Schoenfeld meta-analysis from 2019 that looked at hypertrophy. So we've got like multiple meta-analyses for strength and hypertrophy that were published recently that are saying, look, it's a vehicle for volume. However, what I'll conclude with is to remember that meta-analyses are pooling studies to give us a population-based average. And the reason why I think you see some people who report the anecdote that I do great with a low frequency, the bro split, I make better gains on, I can't recover if I do high frequency. And other people have shared their anecdotes that a higher frequency are better. Like my personal experience has been that upper lowers and full bodies, I tend to get better results. And that's something I've like cataloged pretty extensively. But I think the reason why that is because there are actually some pretty substantial individual differences. So I would recommend everyone check out, there's a 2019 paper that, again, shout out to Stronger by Science, I became aware of by DeMoss and colleagues, and that is individual muscle hypertrophy and strength responses to high versus low resistance training frequencies. And they used a pretty cool design where it was within subject. So they had one limb train high frequency, one limb train lower frequency. And this is really cool because now you're training the same physiological environment, not two different people, but two different limbs of the same person. And they found that there were some pretty divergent responses. So some people obviously did respond better to higher frequencies while other people responded better to lower frequencies. And so I think that's one of those things where if you're looking for a one size fits all answer in the frequency space, you're not going to find it. And if what you take from all this data is that it doesn't make a difference what type of frequency you're on, that's probably not the conclusion. I think what the conclusions are is that frequency has an intrinsic relationship with volume, because we live in a universe that has both time and space. So there's no way to separate the two. And that some people are going to respond much better to lower versus higher frequencies. Probably something to do with recovery, and that probably is also linked to volume and intensity again. So ultimately, I think I have definitely changed my mind in this area, but it's one of those ironic cases where I've changed my mind back to what I thought in 2013. So here we are.
Eric, you should have just kept those deep-rooted convictions from 2013 in the face of the, preliminary evidence. You're like, you guys are wrong. And then lo and behold, 2021, Eric would be like, see, I'm telling you, more evidence came out.
I done flip-flopped.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah. You just wear the flip-flops. You don't flip on the flop,
That's
you don't
right,
belly flop.
100%.
Yeah.
Should have learned from John Kerry, right?
Hey.
That's a 2004 presidential candidate throwback right there. So.
What I was going to say, Eric, is that I think one of the underlying themes that we've always had on Iron Culture is the responsibility of the listener to take a hold of their own journey and to understand, because these are nuanced, complex issues, to your point where you said individual differences, that there is some responsibility on your end, as Eric said, extensively cataloging his lifting. It's not like, who should I follow? It's like, well, wait a second. Like, here's what the evidence shows. Here's the considerations. Then how do you think you're responding? And so it takes a little bit of self-examination, tracking. So even the idea, I think one of the things that people once again poo-pooed first with tracking macros, just to see where you're at, like how many calories you consume. Not that you're going to become, enslaved to this thing forever for all of perpetuity, where I'm always going to track, but just as a tool, right? It's like, why do you have to do that? It's like, I know what I gotta eat to fuel my body. It's like, it's just a metric. It's just a tool, man, to try and find out where you're, to have a calibration of sorts between what you're doing and maybe what you think you're doing, and then perhaps what you need to be doing in order to get your results. So I think that's kind of, as always, one of the tonics for Iron Culture is the responsibility of the listener to take hold of their own journey, their hero's journey.
Mm-hmm. That's well said. I think that is an excellent way to put a bow on this beautiful episode, Omar.
Yeah, it's one of those things. To reiterate, we had to break the fourth wall. We had to come right down to the. I mean, how many steps are on the pyramid? I mean, there's probably like it's at least 200 feet tall. So we came from the top, one level below, which is probably still 196 feet above the ground, because we're not trying to be grounded here. To say, hey, we're just like you. We're hunks just like you. When we wake up, we have the 6-packs. When we walk down the street, we're just like you. People idolize us. Kind of, we get, like, when I was out here with Eric in Toronto, this is true, in these streets. Okay, all 6 feet of Eric, people were turning, and Eric's like, do you think they know, like, from me from 3DMJ? I said, not a chance in hell. They're just looking at you, Eric. Right? Eric's like, do you think it's the work that I did? I said, nah, it's just you being hunky. So it's one of those things that you have to relate to the people. And I think the fundamental point I would like to say in conclusion is that everyone could be a hunk or hunkette, right? It's how you evaluate yourself. And I think you have to be the first person to put forth your own hunkiness before other people see the hunkiness within you.
I want to add to that, but I feel like it would just detract no matter what. So I'm gonna say, hell yes, my brother in hunkiness.
I will say, hey, so I will thank everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture, where we revealed some mistakes that we totally corrected, and now when we take a look back due to the tachyon transmissions, you won't even find that evidence, so don't even bother. I will say you could leave a rating review. It certainly seems like the in thing to do, the hip thing to do, where people in New Zealand are leaving reviews. I mean, someone in Norway left a review after someone else in Norway. We read their review. Leave a number. We won't take offense. It won't be a reflection on us. It's a reflection on you. But certainly, it's out of 5. And so you made it all the way to the end of the episode. If it's not 5 stars, don't bother. It's not worth your time. It's probably too cumbersome for you to do it. We will be reading them. We appreciate everyone. We are here to be gladly independent. Sure, we'll read your reviews, but that's why we said we're not beholden to anyone financially, personally, emotionally, spiritually. So we're just doing the damn thing, and we'll be back here every single Monday. We'll catch you in that next episode.